Well, ladies and gentlemen, welcome. My name is Tom Axworthy, and I'm Public Policy Chair here at Massey College, and I want to welcome you to this conference on the minuscule problem of what's driving crime and what can we do about it. Obviously, one of the largest issues in our current world. So I want to begin by acknowledging that Massey College is on the land of many traditional nations, particularly the treaty lands of the Mississauga Port Credit and the traditional territories of the Haudenosaunee and the Huron-Wendat. So, the public policy program at Massey has recognized for some time the importance of the rule of law in our society and also equity under that rule of law. And in particular, with the many concerns that we have in this college and in our program about poverty, inequalities in our society, Indigenous justice. I come from Winnipeg, where all those blights on our society are so evident in North End Winnipeg as they are in cities across our country, that at the root of so many problems, fentanyl, car thefts, drugs, gangs, they all report somewhere. And organized crime is a piece of the puzzle, though perhaps people don't instantly think of organized crime when they think of how one solves fentanyl or gang-related violence, yet it is there. And therefore we are very lucky to have Peter Sloly, who's a visitor here at Massey, and he has been orienting the college toward broader issues around policing and justice. He sponsored a conference last year and on that subject, and has been the main organizer of today's colloque on the issue of what's driving crime. So I want to introduce Peter. He has a very distinguished career in policing, most latterly as the chief of the Ottawa police force. He's a visitor at Massey College. He is our change maker in residence, and boy, we need change in lots of areas in our society. He's been a tremendous supporter of the public policy program here. Only last week, he participated in and helped organize a panel we had on bail reform, making very interesting points that, of course, there are a hardened group, a smaller group of repeat offenders within bail who are a real issue to be dealt with. One can't ignore that. But that in the larger perspectives, so many of those in our prisons and in detention homes are people who are on bail and have not met their bail conditions. So though the line is be tougher on criminals and tougher on those on bail, yet he brought out that in our systems, our detention homes are already bursting with people on bail. So it is not a simplistic issue around bail, and it certainly is not a simplistic issue around crime and organized crime. So I'm delighted to introduce Peter Sloly, who's made such a contribution to public policy debate around these issues in the country, and in particular to have him as such a strong force here at Massey College. Peter.
Well, good morning, folks, and I say good morning to the people who are in the room as well as those who are joining us online. I'm very grateful, Tom, for the opportunity to support this incredible lecture series that you've been putting on over the years, both in my time in policing when I was at Deloitte in the private sector are now here. I won't say semi-retirement, but it's feeling kind of semi-retirement-ish in the last little while. This is a topic near and dear to my heart. Literally a decade ago, I was on a speaker circuit just like this. I was then a sort of a quasi-experienced deputy chief with the Toronto Police Service. And at that time known in policing circles as one of the more information technology savvy, at least risk-taking police leaders around the application of emerging technology, disruptive technology. And I thought of different titles to offer to Tom around what this session might be. We settled on what's driving crime, and that'll become very apparent as I get into my presentation. But the other one was going to be a hashtag I told you so. And literally a decade ago, many of the factors that are now driving crime and underpinning public safety issues and frustrating Canadians from coast to coast to coast, particularly those that are the most victimized, who are often the most marginalized, and inevitably the most racialized communities, have suffered the most from these macro drivers and have the least ability to impact them. So in between all that, there's a bit of a call to action to people like us who are in this room today and those online that have the ability from their expertise, their experience, their network, their influence, their actual positional power, or their elected official status, to think more deeply, more broadly, and in a more focused way for us to actually make the changes that are needed. Some of them do come with a dollar sticker, but most of them just come with the will and the skill to just do things differently and better. So with that, let me jump into the presentation here. And I'm going to start off with a bit of a case study on what's driving crime, and in this case, particularly Canada's auto theft epidemic. First thing I want to say, a year ago, this would be a different presentation. Right now, a year ago, the tunnel was pretty dark and pretty long. We're still seeing, incredible cases. I think just this past week in Toronto, there was a young lady who went to a door, rang the doorbell, seeing a Ring camera without any mask, tries out a car that's on for sale, backs it over the owner, literally almost killing the person, and drives away. Within 24 hours is captured by the police and is now being prosecuted, both in the courts of public opinion as well as within the justice system. But we're actually in a much better place than we were a year ago because of the leadership of places like Peel Region Police and Chief Durapia. I have Tony Ventura, who's from the Peel Police, who'll be here on the panel right after this to talk about some of the amazing work they're doing there around using old school policing and new school technology to address these type of epidemics. So we're starting to see that we're coming out of this epidemic of car theft, but we got way far into it because of a reason of factors that really nobody had control over. So what's driving this auto theft epidemic? Okay, COVID-19. We had an incredible global experience that had nothing to do with car owners or car thieves in this country. But while the pandemic was raging, we had an economic crisis. So now we go from one crisis into two crises. Rising inflation, rising cost of living, people are on the margins more and more young people out of work, people who are not in the mainstream of society are looking for ways to make ends meet. And unless you've been living on some island in the world where there is no crime, you'll understand the preconditions around which marginalized people get drawn into criminogenic activities. On top of all that, we had a global supply chain issue about a lot of things. If you were doing any renovations in your house, you would have to pay way more money and wait way longer for those cabinets to arrive so that you could install them yourself, right? The same thing was if you were looking to get a new car, even a used car during the pandemic, there was a global supply chain issue around the delivery of new and used vehicles to the market. So guess what Canada became about 2 years into the global pandemic? In the midst of these polycrises of a health crisis, an economic crisis, a supply chain crisis, Canada, as a G7 country, with a massive supply of new and used vehicles, with major ports on the East Coast, the West Coast, and even in central Canada and Montreal, became the perfect place for an epidemic in car theft, with very little to do with having more car thieves in the community or worse police officers stopping car theft from happening. there was not a policing solution to the turn of events that we've seen in the last year. I've said this before many times in my career. People look at a crime spike that's happening and expect the police to deal with the crime spike, when they have very little to do with the conditions that led to the crime spike. And while they have a role to play in reducing that spike, they are not responsible, nor are they accountable for addressing and solving all those problems. When it was just the police running around playing whack-a-mole trying to stop 14-year-old kids or 25-year-old kids with sophisticated technology or transnational organized crime elements within this country and around the world from stealing cars, it was a mission of frustration and failure. But when Canada got together, all three levels of government, national security agencies, national police agencies, provincial police agencies, and municipal police agencies, when it got the car manufacturing sector, the car insurance sector, technologists in the same room, as they did a year ago at the summit hosted by Peel Region Police, that's when the tide started to turn. The complexity of these issues around crime, particularly the major drivers of crime, cannot, never have been, and never will be solved by the police or the justice system alone. So I wanted to start off with this case study to bring a lot of the themes that are going to come out throughout the course of the day. We've learned a lot from this, but there are risks associated to it. So for instance, people are using their Ring cameras now to surveil their streets, not just their driveway and their property, but to surveil their streets. Obviously, we can see an excursion of the private space into the public space. These Ring cameras are now being accessed by police in their investigations. They're showing up as evidence in courtrooms. All of this has challenges for Crown attorneys, defense attorneys, accused and victims of crime, police themselves. All of this has implications. So as we start to find a Band-Aid solution to one problem, we're actually ripping the Band-Aid off other issues. And this, again, layers on the complexity of what we're dealing with. So what else was going on in terms of crime drivers in the system? Lockdown, social isolation. My son missed 2 years of school from JK and grade 1 before he went back to school. While he was in what I call online school, he actually developed some incredible skills, technology skills. At 10 years old now, when I have a technology problem, and I'm a bit of a Luddite, so just to be honest, when I can't get something working on my computer, I go to my 10-year-old son, and he figures it out. That is a wonderful blessing that came out from the social isolation, lockdown periods of the pandemic. But I have to tell you, there were a lot of other sons and daughters in families that were not functioning, struggling to survive, broken, abusive, latchkey kids who were left to basically live on their own, on their devices for hours, days, weeks, months, in some cases years. And that's a tough place to be as a young person. But like my son, they learned computer skills. And they learned how to use the internet. And they learned how to travel through that into the dark net. And they learned a lot of skills that are now making them highly proficient and efficient people who are part of that chain of criminogenic factors who are driving crime up in so many ways. They were easy for online, I'd say, radicalization. In some cases to crime, in other cases to social disorder, and in some rare cases and tragic cases, even into expressions of terror. We had a pandemic within the pandemic. I'd be surprised if there's anybody in this room or anybody online who didn't recognize the impact of isolation and all the other polycrises I've talked about in terms of the mental health fragility of young people, people at my age and stage, and our elderly as well. Before, during, and now, and probably into the foreseeable future, we're going to be still dealing with the crisis that we haven't really dealt with yet, and that's opioids and synthetic drugs. In fact, Canada used to be the victim of synthetic drugs like fentanyl coming into our system. We are now a significant producer and exporter of that, largely because of two factors: the availability of DIY, do-it-yourself videos online that can teach you how to put it together in relatively simple order, and the amazing ability of Canada Post and Amazon and other delivery to bring those chemicals to you and put it together in your basement and make a ton of money locally and make even more money if you plug it into the global supply chain of these community-killing drugs. While we're dealing with this, we're trying to fix it. And so for very thoughtful reasons, places like Scotland, Portugal, and now Canada are making major moves around decriminalization and legalization. A harm reduction model that has proven itself successful in other countries. We're starting to see some of that rolling back in the same countries that initiated it, particularly in Scotland, in places like Oregon in the United States. But we're moving away from the war on drugs into a harm reduction model, and I believe that's the right direction to move in. But it is not a perfect line of progress, and we're seeing many other cases that are conflicting this and conflating it with other issues. So there are no simple solutions, and there are no simple causes. This creates an incredibly challenging space for our police, our courts, and our justice systems to be able to keep up with, our social services and human services agencies to keep up with. Homelessness, housing encampments, across cities and small communities in the country, around North America, and increasingly around the world. Incredibly complex issues that, again, are driving social disorder, reducing community safety. Certainly, the social determinants of health are just in tatters in many of our communities, and increasing numbers of people are falling between the huge holes that have been appearing in our social safety net for a very long time. In the middle of the pandemic, we came to grips. I say we came to grips. Our Indigenous brothers and sisters have come to grips with this decades and decades ago. But Canadians, mainstream Canadians, came to grips with the horrific treatment of our Indigenous people, with the mass graves that really came front and center, thanks to excellent journalism across this country, finally picking up on unheard voices and bringing that to the attention. There was a groundswell of emotion around that. We understood the systemic issues, historical systemic issues at play, including the role of our educators, our religious institutions, our policing and our justice institutions, and elected officials of all parties over decades and decades. An interesting report popped out early in the pandemic for me when I was a chief in Ottawa, and it was my opposite number at Public Health in Ottawa that put out an excellent report on systemic racism in healthcare, really at the onset of the pandemic, and I thought it was incredibly timely because literally a month after this report came out, this gentleman was murdered by a police officer in Minneapolis. And so I found, as a police leader, trying to talk about systemic racism in policing, the systemic racism report in healthcare gave me a very safe space to start that conversation. If we could accept, as Canadians, that there was systemic racism in our healthcare system, which is one of the pillars of Canada, then how could we reject that systemic racism was present in policing? George Floyd's murder really triggered a deeper, broader, I would say global conversation that was nibbled around the edges for the previous decade, but really came home. So again, within a month of George Floyd, I was invited by this Prime Minister and his government to take part in an online discussion around systemic racism in policing. I just want to recognize Devon Clunas, who just came in. Devon was the first black chief of police in Canadian history, a fellow Jamaican. I, at this point, was the only black chief in Canada and the first chief on a national platform to say explicitly that there was systemic racism in policing. Systemic discrimination of all forms, to be clear, misogyny, homophobia, every form of discrimination, but systemic racism, particularly anti-black racism. I was joined on stage by Dale McPhee, who we'll talk about a little bit later on, as well as the president of the Canadian Police Association, Tom Stamatakis. This is the president of the largest police union in Canada. And I want to tell you, Tom acknowledged the existence of systemic racism in policing as well. So we're getting our heads and our hearts around an issue that, quite frankly, for too long was too much in denial. And it took, unfortunately, a period of polycrisis to bring this to bear. I'm going to move quickly now through some of these images. And there's people in this room who are far more expert, have far more experience, have tested this knowledge through research, peer-reviewed, have been professionals in these fields. So I'm just going to do literally a big, broad, thin skim across this, and I'm hoping over the course of the day, as you remain either online, in the room, that you'll hear from some of these experts who will do a much deeper dive into these things. So what is public protest, and what is lawful public protest? This is a huge issue right across the world, in this city right here, where there is so much division around the debate around charter rights, human rights, privacy rights. We'll get into all of that later on. There is no debate around the exponential growth and impact of technology on our society. Our communities have become converged. They're as much in-person communities as we are, as they are online with the audiences that are here. I was literally in a hospital ward 2 nights ago and overhearing a conversation between a younger man and a doctor. And he was talking about the doctor looking at his device and going through and searching in real-time medical information as this person was going through their device and pulling up their own personal records and sharing the information. And the person who was there for treatment said, I don't know how I could live without my device. We are a completely converged society now, which has huge implications. When I was at Deloitte as a partner, one of my former colleagues, Chaim Shel-Shinzer, is over there, and we were involved with major projects like Google Sidewalk Labs, where we were looking at the cybersecurity, the physical security. Ultimately, the decision that Torontonians made was that they were not willing to give up their privacy rights in order to create a smart, interconnected city. Did we lose out on a wonderful, groundbreaking opportunity? Maybe. But did we push back against less thoughtful approaches around how we build a safer, more just society? I woke up this morning and brushed my teeth and checked my phone and chatted with my kids, not knowing that my phone was already talking to my toothbrush and making sure all things were lined up. In the Internet of Things, anything with a signal out there is talking to each other all the time, even when we're asleep. And they're monitoring us and listening to us and compiling data on us, even while we're asleep. And we did that because we let the vampire into the house. You know that old movie, if you don't let the vampire in, if you don't invite them in, they can't come in? We invited the vampire to come in and it's sucking all of our data all the time. It never turns off. Artificial intelligence. Usually when I talk about this, I talk about the doom and gloom and some dystopian future where everything is blown up and we've been taken over by the machines. Well, I'm going to focus on the positive and let others maybe touch on the more negative elements. Without this, we're not going to be able to grow enough food to live. We're not going to be able to manage the diseases that are impacting us. We're not going to be able to figure out how to share wealth more effectively. We're not going to be able to figure out how to tell truth better than what we've been able to do for the longest time. So AI for social good is with us. It's also around for some bad and ugly as well. Blockchain and cryptocurrency are huge enablers and destablers of the economy. They are the fulcrum around which much of organized crime moves and hides its money. But they're also a huge wealth-generating opportunity for young people that, without it, may not be able to afford to buy a house and raise a family down the road. Quantum computing. The amount of power that Ritesh is holding in his hand right now is greater than any computer and any brain that we've ever had in human history. And we're just on the cusp of something more wonderful that's going to just bring the amount of knowledge and ability for us to move forward. We have more data now than ever before. We've got more raw material to use and all this computing. It's fantastic. Unless you're feeding really crappy data into that AI algorithm, in which case you're going to have a really terrible outcome. And we've seen some of that already. So let's hope that we're going to have really good race-based and demographic data. We're going to really feed good, healthy data into those algorithms. And we're going to get the best out of these incredible genies that are long out of their bottles and will never go back in again. Robotics that literally are operating in an operating room here with doctors in Mumbai, with research from around the world, saving lives that couldn't be saved 5 years ago or 10 years ago. I don't want to see this ever in my life, but I know it's happening right now. It's literally happening right now on a scale that we've never seen before. This image that came back from one of the deep space satellites around a black hole, I just found incredible. I stared at this image, almost like it was, don't go into the light. I know, don't go into the light. I just think it's fantastic. At the same time, I just cover my eyes and I see Jeff Bezos, one of the richest men in the world, doing tourism in space at billions of dollars a pop. Somewhere in there is the future of mankind, or the end of it. Augmented and virtual reality. My good friend Ritesh, you're going to hear from him shortly, used to piss me off as a deputy chief. He would come into my office at 8 o'clock in the morning, and he would just pop in unannounced, no knocking on the door, no respect for rank or authority, and come in. I got a great idea, boss. And he shows me some stupid video of a Tyrannosaurus Rex somehow walking around downtown Toronto. And he says, this is what we can do to make parking safer and more efficient. And I said, you're fired. And I fired him. And then he came back the next day and he was still here. And then he showed me how we could use augmented reality in order to help people to understand the parking signs downtown, where you could just hold up your phone to a no standing, no stopping, no parking zone, and it would explain in multiple languages to people what was the lawful thing to do. I still fired him. So, let's look at some of the things that should be keeping you awake at night. Dual realities. In many cases, particularly for young people, but not exclusively, they value their online reputation more than their in-person reputation. They want to be safer online than they do in the reality. So, does that invite the police and the justice system into a sphere that we've never gone before? Are we going to police the digital world when we can barely keep up with policing in the physical world? Online radicalization. It used to take months in order to trigger a person to actual physical action. But the state and the nature of technology, the capabilities of radicalizers using online, can actually trigger a fragile individual in weeks and days and hours. We used to talk about in cybersecurity, 0-hour exploits. They're now 0-hour radicalization exploits against human beings, where police have literally zero time to understand that the threat is activating and do anything about it. Never mind schools or universities or concerts. Deep fake images. This one I have to tell you hits very, very close to home. I did a lot of things as a police officer. One thing I could not deal with was online child pornography. It just destroyed my soul. I have the hugest respect for any police officer, particularly in the days before technology. They had to go through thousands, tens of thousands of hard images, photographs, and then now have to go through terabytes of images of the most vile exploitation. Our police officers need to use AI and machine learning so that they don't have to look at all these images. They can be categorized without a human brain and heart looking at it. They have to have that AI technology, or they cannot psychologically survive. Crown lawyers, defense lawyers have to have that ability, or they will be crushed. But that same ability is creating deepfakes now, which is just further victimizing children, women, movie stars, pop stars. This, for me, is the greatest threat that we've been facing. Literally 5 years ago to this day, I was down at the International Association of Chiefs of Police Conference in Orlando, and a group of military, national security experts and police experts were talking about the biggest future threat. This is 2015, the year before Trump was elected, by the way. 10 years ago. And the number one threat they all came up with was the death of truth. And without truth, you don't have a functioning democracy. Without truth, you can't create policies. Without truth, you can't deliver vaccinations. Without truth, you can't convince people that they should call the police and go to court and participate as a witness. Without truth, you can't trust your neighbor. You can't trust your wife. You can't trust your children. Misinformation, disinformation. I learned this new term last night: malinformation, weaponization of information, polarization based on information. These are the greatest threats, I think, that are facing us right now. We used to talk about cybercrime like there was a crime category called cybercrime. It's just cyber in every crime. There isn't a crime that doesn't have a cyber element involved in it. Drones dropping drugs into maximum correctional facilities. 10 years ago, we made these stupid 3D guns that could fire one bullet and you'd risk killing yourself. Now we have fully automatic weapons that are 3D printed in basements. It's a good friend of mine, Sir Robin Wainwright. He was a UK police commander back in his day, ran their national security agency. He came up with a threat landscape that talked about both the physical landscape and the virtual landscape. In blue, core crimes, your community safety stuff, drinking in parks, mischief, your folks suffering from mental health, homelessness, theft from your auto, that type of thing. But now we're looking at global issues like epidemics, pandemics, mental health addictions, natural disasters, climate crisis, terrorism, lone wolf attacks, protests and demonstrations that have nothing to do with your city, but are paralyzing your city nonetheless. And then, of course, there's the cyber element, cyber warfare, which is just not a war. It's just continuous, 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, literally around the world. It's the war between the wars, as a good friend of mine explained to me. And I could go on, ransomware attacks. I talked about the polarization issues and the war against rights, privacy, human, and charter. And we're going to hear from the amazing Dr. Ann Kavukian about this a little bit later on. So it's like an escalating arms race. The bad guys are using the technology and exploiting these polycrises. Well, the good guys are going to get in there too, right, at some point? Unless you think the bad guys are the good guys and the good guys are the bad guys. And that's a whole other debate for another time. So we're doing biometric investigations. There's a homicide solved by an older gentleman using a Fitbit that actually put him at the scene of the crime when he had an alibi that said he wasn't at the scene of the crime. That's really cool. All sorts of privacy issues around that. We used a DNA sample acquired years ago to solve a historic cold case, a mass murderer. Really fantastic piece of police work. But now, does that mean every time you gave blood in the last 10 years, that at some point down the road, the police are going to get that through a warrant, and they're going to come and get you for something that places you at the scene of the crime? These are challenges. Weaponized robots. This is a shooting that took place in Dallas about 5 years ago. A number of the members of the community, at a parade, numbers of the members of the community were shot and killed. Police officers were shot and killed. The accused was holed up in a garage one way in, and it was a kill zone, and more cops would have been killed if they went in there. They sent the robot in, they rigged it up with an IED, and they blew him up. That was the end of the gunfight. Are you ethically confused around that? You should be. Do you want police officers rigging up IEDs on robots and blowing people up? More people would have died, for sure. But is that what you want? Because that's the debate. First responders are using drones, ambulance, fire, police. Why is that important in Toronto? Do you love traffic in this city? I hate it. I have PTSD for traffic in this city. And I don't mean that lightly, okay? But in the old days, when I first came on as a cop, we had these wheels, the invention of the wheel. Devon is nodding his head. And we use that to measure out the accident scene. So it's like minus 30 degrees, there's a snowstorm happening, because that's when the accidents happen. And you're walking around a major highway, marking out the scene with these sticks, and you close down these major traffic centers, literally for hours while we did this. With a drone, you fly it across, it takes images, GPS located, and now you've done that within minutes. Think about the billions of dollars we're saving by this. But those drones are capturing images as well. And so could they be used for mass surveillance later on? Facial recognition. Oh, we could go into all that. Clearview AI and everything else. But you're a cop and you're sitting there and you're looking at hundreds of thousands of images of people who are victims or are victimizers. And it's going to take you days, weeks, months, maybe years to solve a crime. But Clearview AI comes in through the back door and says, hey, we've got this thing, and it'll help you to solve crimes faster. And you're thinking, as a frontline cop, I need to support this victim. I need to solve this crime. I need to put this bad person in jail. So I'm going to try this on my desktop without seeking approval up to the chief of police. And that's how they got in the back door of a lot of places. That's the conflict that we find ourselves in. Predictive analytics, this is your minority report, but with scarce resources in policing and healthcare and social services, how do you use analytics to put your most scarce resource and your best resource, a human being with compassion and professionalism and expertise and experience, into the highest risk area at the right time? We just don't have the time to figure it out perfectly. And so this is what we need, but that comes at a cost. Next generation 911, I can spend a lot of time talking about it, but probably the best expert that I could ever have, Tony Ventura, is going to come in, and Peel Region is knocking it out of the park in terms of where we're going with this. Instead of just calling the police and saying, I think I see something suspicious outside, you can do that. You can text the police. You can take a photo of your phone of what you think is suspicious. And you can take a video, and you can send all that in to a call taker and a dispatcher and an AI program. And they can start to triage this information and figure out whether or not it needs a police response, a social services response, a mental health response, or no response at all. That's just a shadow of a tree, ma'am. Everything's fine. And I can see on my screen right now there's a police car in the neighborhood. I'll ask them to drive by your house. You should see the car go by in about half a minute or so. Integrated call taking and dispatch. It's now not just 911. It's 211, 311, 511. One call in for anybody that needs a range of services, and those services will be triaged using some form of machine learning and AI. in order to get the right service to you, not two police officers at $150,000 each driving a $500,000 worth of car. I talked about demographic and race-based data underpinning all of this. The incredible work that Jim Rankin, Michelle Shepard, and Jennifer Quinn did, transformational, impactful journalism on racial profiling, carding, within this city and across this country, was based on the early days of demographic and race-based data collection and analysis. We ignored it, we fought against it, we had a war about it. I think it was almost a full-on war. Jim, you'll talk about that maybe later on. But at the end of the day, we're in a better place. Some cops will argue no. Most will say, yeah, we're not where we need to be, but we're in a better place. And now the City of Toronto is, I think, leading in the case of alternatives to policing in terms of safe TO. So again, instead of having police officers being the only form of response on a 24-hour basis, we can send a range of other agencies in different combinations out to individuals that need a customized, compassionate approach rather than a one-size-fits-all approach. So here's what the old school cops, my generation, guns on the hips, smartphones in the hand. I mean, smartphones in the hand 10 years ago, that would have been space age. Now, every cop's got a smartphone issued to them, and one that they've got for their family as well. So here's what new school policing might look like. Every one of these areas are already in implementation in some form of police service somewhere in the world. Heads-up augmented reality glasses, body-worn cameras, and AI analytics to do searches on all of the terabytes of information from these body-worn cameras so they could be used for training and discipline and prosecution services. Protective microfibers that not just your vest stops a bullet, but the uniform might stop a knife attack as well as keeping it breathable. Robotic exoskeletons. As a young cop, I blew up my back in an arrest of a drug warrant up in Flemington Park. I could have stayed on the road with an exoskeleton and continued to perform. I was off the road for almost 2 years before I could get back on the road again. Biometric wearables to make sure that we can keep track of the health of our officers. If they're in trauma or they're simply in stress, think about if we had a biometric watch on the hand of the officer involved in the shooting of Sammy Yatim, and we saw his readings just going off the charts, and we're able to radio in, based on the biometrics of that cop, to the sergeant on the scene saying, you need to pull that cop back and put somebody else up front who's much calmer. By the way, Jody's way calmer, and she's got the negotiation course. Let's get her in front of Sammy. Think about the outcome that could have happened there. Again, smartphone devices, use of force options, including sensors on every one of your use of force options. So if you say in your use of force report, my gun wasn't out, but we can actually see that your finger was both on the handle and on the trigger from the sensors on there, we've got a different story now. Old school courts, and this is a pretty tech-savvy court coming out of the pandemic. Well, here's what the new school courts might look like. Former Attorney General Michael Bryant is going to talk about this extensively later on in his comments, so I don't want to do a disservice. But again, you're going to have judges, we have a jurist here, my good friend Julie Thorberg. You're going to have judges wearing AR and VR glasses. Juries will be there, and they'll be walking through a crime scene, literally, physically walking through a crime scene, 360 degrees, in real time. Smartphone devices are ubiquitous. AI assessments of decisions, risk assessments, bail decisions, show cause hearings. Scary, but happening. Integrated data, healthcare data, crime data, education data for the victim and the accused, so you have a much more rich picture of the human being that is before you in the court. Virtual courts that are live streamed. Ritesh may talk about the first virtual moot court held in the world. Cybersecurity, obviously, because if we've got more data, we're going to have to secure it better. And then privacy and human rights. Old school facilities for corrections. New school facilities for corrections. Surveillance sensors, integrated data systems, e-bars and GPS bracelets. So instead of having somebody warehoused behind bars, we know where they are in the facility, and we can be able to provide security around that. AR and VR recreation. So instead of being locked up for 20 years, you can actually take a vacation, or you can visit your family room, or you can go and see your dying grandmother. Biometric wearables, so again, we can track your health. We'll know if you're taking illicit drugs, and we can get you the right help inside prisons. And then the combination of data, again, medical, social services, psychological staff, who can come to you, not just a corrections officer. All right, I'm getting into the end of my presentation, and we're going to transition into what I hope will be a really important and impactful panel coming up. social determinants of health. If I go back to that original story about what's driving crime in terms of the car theft epidemic, they're really coming out of the pandemic. We're talking about a group of factors that were underpinning crime. Nutrition, education, housing, employment, transportation, resources, family, safety. I should have put finances in there. Well, I guess employment is in there. When you have these factors that are just not healthy in a person, in a family, in a neighborhood, in a community, in a city, in a province, in a country, Dr. Kwame Mackenzie from the Wellesley Institute will tell you you're going to have crime and victimization. And it'll spike, and it'll be ugly, and it'll be complex, and the cops will not be able to solve it on their own. So by design, think about how we can work as far upstream as possible, intentionally, to address these issues so we have less downstream problems. You'll never get to zero downstream, but you'll get less and less. Our Supreme Court has really exported Canada's sense of rights to the world. Beverly McLaughlin and her influence on the GDPR, particularly Article 22, which for me was really important about 5 years ago when AI was really starting to come to the fore in terms of who was actually making the call around police, national security, and justice interventions. And this really spells out in fancy language. It better be a human being making the final call and not a machine. There are many other things you're going to learn from Ann Kavukian around what else needs to go into that. But at the end of the day, there should be no justice system, no police service, in my humble opinion, where the call is made by a machine. I won't even speak much to this slide, except to say thank you to Ann. And we're going to hear more from her around how this is not just nice to know stuff. This is absolutely need to do stuff. Privacy by design. Good friend of mine, Chief Justice Tulloch. He actually is the chair of our anti-black racism committee here at Massey College. I've known him since he was a young crown back in the days. Julie has far more access to him these days than I do. But community safety and well-being by design. Chief Justice Tulloch took on the challenge of addressing carding and racial profiling, and then from there overhauled the Police Services Act to make sure that he built into it the legal requirement, Devon, the legal requirement for not the police of any jurisdiction to lead on community safety, but to be a part of a team which included healthcare, public education, the not-for-profit sector, demographic representation from whatever community you happen to be in, to co-produce the plan, to co-implement the plan, to co-evaluate the efficacy of the plan as a legal requirement here in Ontario. It's now being replicated in reviews of the Police Services Act in British Columbia, in Alberta, in Saskatchewan, in Manitoba, and across the country. Groundbreaking. Working upstream by design. The sergeant in that picture there is a Toronto police sergeant. I hope he's been promoted. His name was Jeff Lausch, Jeff Lausch. This is the apartment building. Jim, you remember this apartment building. There was a little video about a former mayor of ours, Rob Ford, that was circulating. It was made in and around this complex in northwest Etobicoke. One road in to 3 huge buildings looking onto a central court. One of the toughest gangs lived in there, 99% Somali community. 99% victimization of young Somali men by other young Somali men. Literally no social infrastructure. The criminal determinants, social determinants of health, almost completely absent. And inefficient policing, over-policing and under-servicing. I was responsible for all policing in this place as a deputy chief. So I take accountability for that. And that's why I flipped it on its head. And I recruited some of the best police officers, including old white cops like Jeff, along with our new Somali officers that we had just started recruiting. Devon, does this sound familiar to stuff you did in Winnipeg? And we plugged a very diverse, highly educated, extremely compassionate, and very experienced and very tough set of cops into one of the toughest pieces of postal code anywhere in Canada. Prior to this, there was an average of 15 firearm shootings per year in this complex alone, not in Etobicoke, just in this complex. 5 of which were homicides on average per year for 3 years before. Here's the numbers after. We reduced shootings from 15 per year to 1. We reduced homicides from 5 per year to 0. With this caveat, on year 365 of the first year, we had our first shooting for the year. Dang. By the way, there was a study done by Stats Canada that said every homicide, this is almost a 10-year-old study now, every homicide from the start of the police response to the before the incarceration, assuming conviction, costs on average $5 million. So if money matters to you, and it should, we saved 30 lives over those 3 years. At $5 million per homicide, that's $150 million that was available for reinvestment into communities like this. We rebuilt community capacity. Our officers went in on their own time and raised money, found furniture, and built a library in the basement of this complex where kids could go after school and get homework supports, as well as a safe space while their parents were working 2-3 jobs. We improved public trust in the police, we strengthened community partnerships, and we improved police morale, and I should say, and police safety, because that was a safer place for our cops to work as well as for those kids to live. This is Dale McPhee, the chief in Edmonton. I think pound for pound, I think the best chief of his generation. Nish is pushing him hard in Peel. He came up with the first integrated hub table that actually in Prince Albert, Saskatchewan, brought together an integrated group of institutions to look at highly complex issues affecting individuals, families, and communities. And inevitably, the police brought the most problems to the table and walked away with the least to solve. Partners who were better positioned were the ones left behind. The biggest challenge we had, and this is where I first met Anne, was sharing data. The cops wouldn't share their criminal data, the education system wouldn't share their education data, the healthcare system said, hell no, get your hands off our data. And Anne said, no, we can do this. The legislation actually allows for it, it's why we built it. Now you gotta be really careful or I'll come and slap your hands. But we can do this, and now we're doing it. I built a second hub here in Toronto, and now they're ubiquitous everywhere. My contribution, smart, safe cities. Google Labs, with great respect, wasn't it, but this could be it. This could be it, where we look within our organizations, whether it's Massey College, Toronto Police, City Hall, and we look at our enterprise risk management systems, our IT systems, our legal systems to protect rights, our HR systems, hiring the right talent, and we build the right systems internally, and then we build that out into the ecosystems, where we bring in our mass transit and roadways, our utilities and critical infrastructure, bylaw and regulators and oversight bodies, private-public partnerships, all the rest of it. But at the center of it, by design, you have to consider security, physical and cyber, and rights always have to be up front. So I'm going to end on this story. I don't know if anybody recognizes this individual here, but his name is Mayor Mocus. Bogota, Colombia, at the height of the Medellin cartel, one of the most dangerous cities in the entire world, and a country that had a disproportionate impact on the global drug trade. Became one of the safest cities literally overnight. Literally overnight. Why? Because of AI? No. Machine learning? No. Big data analytics? No. Some amazing new gadget device? No. It came from an individual that saw human beings, humanity, and humane treatment of each other as a centerpiece of his political platform. He was a professor from a university like this who had studied sociology, understood the context of human beings and how they work in concert with each other. So Bogota, Colombia had a huge gun violence problem, as you can imagine. He halved it overnight by 50% reduction. He used rudimentary data to look at where the majority of the shootings were taking place and when. And no surprise to anybody in this room, in bars where there's a lot of booze, with young men who had a lot of testosterone, using firearms, and without the other social constraints around them. So he recruited their mothers, their grandmothers, their aunts, because in the culture of Bogota, women are the ultimate authority. He convinced a no booze period during the heightened hours when the shootings would take place, so he got the private sector involved. The women went down to that area and hung out with the men, and the boys kept the guns away. 50% reduction in homicides. Now they had a worse problem with traffic accidents because nobody trusted the cops in Bogota, Colombia. They were corrupt. Usually in a place where there's a lot of crime, you first have to look at the police corruption, the political corruption. Well, there was political corruption and police corruption in Bogota. And that meant when you were directing traffic at an intersection, a police officer in uniform, nobody cared about them. They ignored them, and they ran into each other, and they killed each other. So he hired clowns. Yeah, he went to his university to the arts department, and he hired young kids to come out and dress up as clowns, and he put them in the high accident locations. And you had a clown directing traffic in the high accident location. Guess what? Nobody ever misses the clown. And clowns are really good with those white gloves at directing traffic. 50% reduction, 50% reduction in traffic collisions and fatalities. We're going to talk a lot about technology today, but I do not want anyone to lose sight of the humanity involved in that. In fact, the best advice I've got around the thinking of AI and its potential evil is that if we allow it to take our human qualities away from us, we're facing a tough, tough situation. But if it allow it to free us to be more human than we've ever been before, more humane than we've ever been before, then it might be a game changer for good. So I'll leave you with these thoughts. Be courageous. The genie's out of the bottle. Embrace this sucker. Work with it. Take it on. But be compassionate. Use IT and AI to be more human and humane, not less. Take calculated risks, because there's no perfect formula, there's no silver bullet, there's no completely wonderful test tube lab where you can work out all the bugs before it rolls out onto the street. With our best intentions, we're still going to go, oops, I never thought of that. Wow, I didn't think it was going to do that. Be data informed, but take risks. Be willing to admit your mistakes. Be willing to forgive others, including institutions like the police, for the mistakes that they make. Do the right things and protect the rights for all people, not just for some people. And unite as much as we can. I am tired, so sick and tired of this cancel culture that we find ourselves in. Somebody makes a mistake, cancel them forever. Cancel that entire institution forever. Cancel that program. Cancel everything. Cancel tomorrow. The only way we're going to get to a more just and safe society, the only way we're going to be able to develop ethical change leaders like the junior fellows in this college here, the only way we're going to be able to get more socially just communities, smarter, safer cities, and sustainable societies is if we unite together and co-produce public safety, public trust, and public value. I'm 2 minutes over, but I hope this has seeded some great conversations and panel discussions. Keynote speakers are going to come up shortly. I know you're all busy people, online and in this room here. As much as you can, please stay for as long as you can. Ask questions, kick the tires on things that I'm saying, the panel members are saying. We have the ability to take online questions, obviously in-room questions. In about 2 minutes, I'm going to get a group of wonderful experts up on the stage here. I've mentioned their names already, but I'll introduce them more formally after. Please stay engaged throughout the day and raise your hand, raise your concern, raise your idea. I'm raising a call for action. The glass isn't half empty, it's half full. And a country and a society like Canada can and should be a leader in all of these areas going forward. We have the human capacity, the human talent, the human compassion, and a history of doing more good than evil. So we can get this done together. Thank you very much, and I look forward to the rest of the day.